My name is Margaret Lawson, and until that night, I thought I had endured every kind of loss life could hand me. I had buried a husband, raised a son mostly on my own, and carried the weight of quiet loneliness that settles in when you grow older and the phone stops ringing as often. But nothing compared to standing in the rain, my body shaking from smoke and fear, while the house I had lived in for nearly 40 years collapsed into flames behind me. The fire came like a thief. One moment, I was sitting in my armchair with an old quilt across my knees, and the next, smoke curled under the doorframe and filled my lungs. I remember grabbing my purse, stumbling out barefoot, the night air colder than I could bear. The red glow swallowed the windows, devouring the curtains my mother had sewn, the photographs on the mantel, the little carvings my late husband had made. Every memory we had built together turned to ash in minutes. By the time I reached the street, neighbors were shouting, sirens wailing in the distance. But all I could think was, I have nowhere to go. So I ran, not to the shelter the firefighters pointed me toward, not to a hotel, but to the one place that should have been safe. My son Daniel's house, my only child, my last anchor in the world. The rain soaked me as I pounded on his front door, desperate, shivering so hard my teeth knocked together. The porch light came on, and Daniel's face appeared, shadowed by worry. For one brief heartbeat, I thought I was saved. "Mom," he whispered, his voice uncertain, and I tried to step inside. But before he could move, his wife, Vanessa, appeared over his shoulder. Her arms were folded, her eyes sharp as glass. She didn't even blink before she said, clear and cold, "She can't stay here. I don't want her in this house." The door slammed shut. The sound of the lock clicking echoed louder in my ears than the crackle of fire engines down the street. I stood there, rain streaming down my face, trying to understand how a son could let his mother drown outside while his wife's words sealed the decision. And in that moment, something in me broke, but another part of me woke up. Rain wrote silver slashes across the porch as I stood staring at the door that had just locked me out. I could still hear the muffled rise and fall of voices inside, Daniel's soft, frantic murmur, and Vanessa's crisp reply, final as a gavel. I pressed my palm to the wood once, not to beg but to feel something solid. Then I pulled my hand back and walked down the steps, one careful foot after another. Because pride is a kind of spine, and mine was the only thing holding me up. The street felt brighter than it should have, littered with red and blue strobes bouncing off puddles. I turned toward the glow where my house used to be. The engine's pump thumped like a heavy heart. Steam curled from the roofline as hoses hissed, and the old oak out front drooled ash onto the sidewalk. A young firefighter spotted me and jogged over with a blanket. He draped it around my shoulders without asking and guided me to the curb. "Ma'am, you live here?" he asked. I did. My voice sounded like paper. 40 years. He nodded in that careful way kind people do when there's nothing useful to say. Someone else brought a bottle of water, and a paramedic checked the oxygen level on my finger. The monitor beeped, neat and indifferent. I watched the numbers like they were a verdict. "Any family we can call?" the paramedic asked. "My son," I said, and the words caught. "He's nearby. Want me to—" "No." The answer surprised even me. I tightened the blanket and felt heat seep into me slowly, the way courage does. "No, thank you." Across the street, water ran down the gutter, carrying tiny black islands of my life. The quilt my mother made, the frames from the mantel, the oak rocker my husband sanded by hand, gone. But I had my purse. I had my keys, though they opened nothing now. I had my name. That mattered. I asked if I could step closer to the porch to see what was left. A captain walked with me, boots biting into wet gravel. Up close, the smell shifted. Wood and plastic. Yes, but something sharper threaded through it. Sweet and chemical, like a spilled cleaner that didn't belong. I tucked that scent into memory the way you pocket a note you'll need later. "We'll get you to the community center," the captain said. "Warm cots, hot coffee." "Give me a minute," I said, eyes on the dark square where my front window had been. I thought of Daniel's face in the doorway, of the lock sliding home, and a slice of cold moved through me that had nothing to do with rain. I pulled my blanket tighter, took out my phone, and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in years. I didn't press call. Not yet. I stood there until the last jet of water hissed into silence, and the house went from flame to steam to a black, listening thing. Then I slipped the phone back into my purse. If a door wouldn't open for me tonight, I would find the hinge. 6 months earlier. My mornings had a quieter rhythm. I brewed coffee in the same dented percolator my husband once swore he'd replace but never did, and I read the local paper at the kitchen table by the bay window. The house creaked in familiar ways, old wood shifting with the sun, and I felt safe. Back then, the worst noise I endured was the hum of Vanessa's SUV pulling into my driveway without calling first. She'd breeze in with her oversized tote and her smile stretched too wide. "Just thought I'd check on you, Margaret," she'd say, dropping her sunglasses on my counter like she owned the space. She always found a reason to walk through each room, fingertips brushing the banister, eyes scanning the furniture as though she were appraising it. One afternoon, she arrived with Daniel trailing behind her, his tie loosened, his face tired. She laid a glossy brochure on my table, the kind with cheerful couples strolling through wide hallways. "These retirement communities are so wonderful now," she cooed. "Fitness centers, book clubs, even wine tastings. Wouldn't you feel safer around people your own age?" I folded the brochure and slid it back. "I feel safe here," I said. "This house is my age. We understand each other." Daniel gave me a half-hearted smile. "She's just looking out for you, Mom." But it wasn't looking out. It was looking in. Every visit turned into a suggestion about selling the place. A realtor showed up once, claiming Daniel had booked an appraisal. Another time, Vanessa produced a spreadsheet with housing values from our neighborhood. "The market is so hot," she said, tapping her manicured nail on the page. "You could get 200 grand. Easy. Imagine what that could do for you." "I'm imagining what it would take away," I answered, and for a flicker of a second, something sharp flashed across her face before the smile returned. I noticed Daniel growing quieter, avoiding my eyes. He never contradicted her. At dinner one Sunday, she brought her phone to the table, showing pictures of a lakeside condo. "This could be perfect," she said sweetly, "and we'd handle everything for you. Less stress." I set my fork down. "Steady." "I'm not interested." She laughed lightly, but the sound carried an edge. That was the night I first felt the subtle weight of being outnumbered in my own family. It was also the first time I wondered if my son still had a voice, or if it had been taken from him piece by piece. The night the fire came, I had just settled into my chair with a paperback I'd read a dozen times before. Outside, the wind pushed at the trees, and rain streaked the glass in soft, steady lines. It was the kind of night that usually felt like a cocoon. I remember adjusting the lamp when a smell, harsh, unfamiliar, cut through the ordinary scent of old wood and coffee grounds. At first I thought it was the furnace. Then the smoke alarm screamed, The hallway filled with gray so thick it stung my eyes. I grabbed my purse from the hook, stumbled toward the door, coughing until my chest ached. By the time I reached the porch, flames had already licked across the living room windows. The house, my house, was a burning lantern against the storm. Neighbors shouted. Someone dialed 911 and I stood barefoot on the wet lawn, rain mingling with sweat, watching everything I owned turn to fire. Sirens arrived, the street jammed with hoses and flashing lights. I clutched the blanket a firefighter threw around me and tried to make sense of the smell still in my nose. It wasn't just smoke. It was sweet, chemical, the way nail polish remover clings to the air. I knew wood and fabric don't burn like that. Something about it pressed at the back of my mind, wrong and deliberate. Then I saw her. Across the street, Vanessa stood under an umbrella, her phone raised, the glow of the screen lighting her face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even surprised. She was taking pictures, one after another, like someone documenting a property, not a disaster. I caught a snatch of her voice when she lowered the phone to answer a call. Over the wail of the trucks, I heard her say, "The lot will sell faster this way." My stomach turned cold. She saw me staring and smiled, small and sharp, before slipping into her car. No one else seemed to notice her leave. I wrapped the blanket tighter and tried to convince myself I hadn't heard right. Maybe I was shaken. Maybe smoke was muddling my thoughts. But when the captain later told me the fire had multiple points of origin, that it burned too fast for a simple accident, my doubts cracked. I carried the memory of her smile like a stone in my pocket, heavy and impossible to ignore. That night, standing barefoot in wet grass, I realized the fire hadn't just taken my house. It had given me a new kind of fear, the kind that wears a familiar face and sleeps under my son's roof. In the days after the fire, I stayed in a small room at the community center the Red Cross had set up. The cot sagged, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and instant coffee, and I spent long nights staring at the ceiling, replaying Vanessa's smile in my mind. Each time I tried to convince myself it was grief or shock playing tricks on me. I remembered the chemical smell, the captain's words about multiple points of origin, and her voice saying the lot would sell faster. Doubt turned into something sharper. I needed someone who would believe me. That's when I thought of Richard Hale. He'd been a close friend of my late husband, a corporate lawyer back in the day who never quite retired in spirit. We hadn't spoken much since his wife passed, but I still had his number written in the back of my address book. My fingers trembled when I dialed, and part of me expected him to brush me off politely. Instead, he answered on the second ring, his voice steady and warm. Within an hour, he was sitting across from me in the shelter cafeteria, a paper cup of coffee in his hand. I told him everything about Vanessa's constant pressure to sell, Daniel's silence, the fire, the photographs, the words I'd overheard. Richard listened without interrupting, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. "You're saying she set the fire," he said at last, not as a question but as a statement. "I'm saying nothing else makes sense," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Then we need proof, real proof, and you can't confront her head on. Not yet." That's how the plan began. Richard knew private investigators, forensic accountants, even a retired detective who still did consulting. He promised to pull them in quietly. My role, he explained, was to look weak, to act as if I had no choice but to lean on Vanessa. Let her think she was winning. Let her get careless. It stung, pretending to be smaller than I was. But it gave me a strange power, too. When Vanessa came to check on me at the shelter, talking about temporary guardianship papers and how she could manage my insurance claim, I let my hands shake just enough to sell the part. She smiled with satisfaction, never noticing the tape recorder Richard had slipped into my purse. For the first time since the fire, I felt something other than grief. I felt the quiet burn of purpose. The house was gone, but I still had fight in me, and I intended to use every ounce of it. Vanessa wasted no time. Barely a week after the fire, she arrived at the shelter with a folder tucked neatly under her arm and that bright, brittle smile of hers. "These are just some temporary documents," she said sweetly, sliding the papers across the table. "A power of attorney, you know, to help manage your insurance claim and bank accounts while you're recovering. Recovering, as though I were the one who had lost control of my mind rather than the home that had burned to the ground." I looked down at the neat stack of legalese, pretending to squint at the lines. My hands trembled, but not from weakness. Richard had prepared me for this moment. "I don't know," I murmured, letting my voice catch. "It all feels so complicated." "That's why you have us," she said quickly, placing her manicured hand on mine. Her eyes glittered with impatience behind the smile. "Daniel and I will make sure everything is taken care of. All you have to do is sign." I let the silence hang, then gave the smallest of nods. She relaxed, convinced. She didn't notice when 2 days later, I signed a very different power of attorney, one drafted by Richard's colleagues, notarized quietly in his office. That document gave him authority to act on my behalf, but only in my interest. It contained clauses that nullified any conflicting paperwork. To Vanessa's eye, the paper she carried looked official, but the one in my possession was the only one that mattered in court. At the same time, Richard had me move what remained of my savings into a separate account under his supervision. It wasn't much, years of careful budgeting whittled down by rising bills, but it was mine, and it was safe. Vanessa never even noticed the shift. She was too busy convincing Daniel that I was overwhelmed and needed firm guidance. I played my role to perfection. At dinner one evening, I let her prattle on about contractors who could clear the lot quickly. I stirred my soup slowly, eyes down, voice small. "I don't know if I can make decisions like this anymore," I said, and she smiled as if she'd already won. But in the quiet of my borrowed room later that night, I whispered to myself the truth. She had underestimated me. She thought the fire had broken me, but all it had done was strip away the illusions. Now I knew exactly who she was, and exactly what I needed to do. Evidence doesn't come gift-wrapped. It has to be chased down, gathered piece by piece, until the whole picture is undeniable. Richard reminded me of that every time we met in the small conference room his firm still kept downtown. He'd spread out files and photographs while I sat across from him, hands folded, forcing myself to stay patient. The first break came from a neighbor's doorbell camera. A retired school teacher who lived 2 houses down had one of those ring devices pointed toward the street. Richard's investigator asked politely, and within a day, we had grainy but clear footage. Vanessa's SUV idling near my house at 11:30 that night, minutes before the blaze erupted. The headlights cut off, the silhouette unmistakable as she stepped out and disappeared from the frame. She wasn't delivering cookies. Next came the receipt. The retired detective tracked purchases at a local hardware store. There it was, time-stamped 2 days before the fire, a cash transaction for industrial solvent and rags. The clerk remembered the woman, tall, sharp-featured, expensive purse slung over her arm. He didn't know her name, but I did. Still, Richard wanted more. "Juries like voices," he said. "Nothing sinks a person faster than hearing their own words." So I kept the little recorder in my purse. Vanessa made it easier than I expected. One afternoon, she cornered me in Daniel's living room. her tone sweet enough to rot teeth. "If you just sign over guardianship," she whispered, "you won't have to worry about making mistakes. Otherwise, well, judges sometimes decide people your age can't manage on their own. Nursing homes have waiting lists, you know." Her words bled into the recorder, each syllable sharp as glass. I kept my face blank, eyes lowered, playing the part of a tired old woman. Inside, my pulse hammered. When I played the tape for Richard later, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "This," he said, tapping the recorder, "is the nail in her coffin." Piece by piece, the net tightened. Camera footage, a receipt, a threat whispered too loudly, every detail stacked on the last until even Daniel's silence couldn't drown it out. I carried the recorder back in my purse, resting beside my folded hands. For the first time since the fire, I slept a little easier. The flames had taken my house, but the truth was beginning to burn brighter than Vanessa's lies. The notary's office smelled faintly of ink and coffee, a neutral place where people signed away pieces of their lives. Vanessa sat beside me, her posture perfect, nails gleaming as she tapped the folder on the desk. Daniel hovered near the window, pale and restless, but silent as ever. "Just sign, Margaret," Vanessa said, her voice syrup sweet. "Then you won't have to worry about anything anymore." I lifted the pen slowly, my hand steady, but before the tip touched paper, the door opened. Richard stepped inside, flanked by two detectives in plain clothes. Their badges flashed, their eyes sharp. "Vanessa Collins," one of them said, "you're under arrest for arson and attempted fraud." The room froze. Vanessa's smile cracked, disbelief flickering before rage set in. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, standing too quickly. But the detective read her rights as he pulled her wrists behind her back. The pen slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Daniel stumbled forward. "Wait, there must be some mistake." Richard laid a folder on the desk, thick with photographs, receipts, and transcripts. "There's no mistake, Daniel. The evidence is overwhelming. Your wife set the fire. She tried to strip your mother of everything she owned." My son's knees gave out, and he sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut was louder than any siren I'd heard the night of the fire. For the first time in months, I felt the ground solid beneath me. I had been burned out of my home, pushed to the edge of my family, but I was not powerless. The door that had once slammed in my face had opened again, this time for justice. Weeks later, I sat across from Daniel in a sterile visiting room at the county jail. His shoulders slumped, his eyes rimmed red. "Mom," he whispered, "I didn't light the fire. I didn't know I just wanted peace." "Peace?" My voice shook. "You let her drive me out into the rain. You chose silence over me." He reached for my hand, but the table between us kept us apart. "I'm sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." I drew in a long breath. I wanted to forgive, the way mothers are supposed to, but forgiveness without accountability is just surrender. "I hope you learn from this, Daniel," I said quietly. "But my life can't wait for you to decide who you are." When I walked out, the autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of leaves instead of smoke. Richard was waiting by the car. He didn't speak, just offered me his arm, and I took it. Months turned to a year. A modest house in the suburbs became my new refuge, its walls fresh with paint, its rooms filled with secondhand furniture that felt like mine because I chose it. Richard became more than a friend. He became my partner, steady and kind. One afternoon, My granddaughter Sophie arrived with her baby boy. She placed the child in my arms, his small fingers curling around mine. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: renewal. The fire had taken so much, but it had not taken me. I looked at Sophie, at the baby, at Richard smiling from the doorway, and I knew the truth. From the ashes of betrayal, I had built a life stronger than the flames could ever destroy. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.